In the silence of an ordinary hotel room, smelling of cheap soap and stale bed linen, a man in a gray suit methodically checks the contents of his suitcase. He is not looking for valuables or souvenirs. His fingers, accustomed to precise and sparse movements, touch objects that for anyone else would be a symbol of nightmare, but for him are merely tools of his professional activity. This man is not a criminal in the usual sense of the word. He is an official representative of the state's will, an invisible hand punishing those whom the system has deemed superfluous. In his pocket lies a one-way train ticket, and in his memory, dozens of faces he saw in the last moments of their earthly journey. He knows that tomorrow he will return home, kiss his wife, help his son with homework, and sit down to dinner as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, behind the armor of professional calm, something is already beginning to grow that will forever separate him from the world of ordinary people. This is not a story about political intrigues, but about how the human psyche transforms under the pressure of tasks that contradict the very nature of life, and why those who once crossed this threshold never find their way back to normality. To understand how the personality of a state liquidator is formed, one must look behind the scenes of the systems that created such specialists throughout the 20th century. This was not a random collection of people with sadistic tendencies. On the contrary, security structures around the world, from foggy London to snowy Moscow, sought the most stable, disciplined, and, strangely enough, morally resilient candidates. The paradox was that to carry out the darkest assignments, a person capable of sincerely believing in the righteousness of their cause was required. Selection began with a thorough study of the biography, where the absence of any deviations was a mandatory condition. The future agent had to be an ideal citizen, a loving father, and a devoted patriot. It was this normality that served as the foundation on which the edifice of professional deformation was later erected. The state did not seek monsters. It created them from ordinary people, using their best qualities, loyalty, diligence, and a sense of duty, as levers to destroy their own psyche. The training process transformed a living person into a complex mechanism where emotions were replaced by algorithms. The first stages of training were aimed at desensitization, a gradual habituation to the termination of life as a technical process. Special services psychologists developed methods allowing the objectification of the target. The one against whom the action was directed ceased to be a person with a name, family, and dreams. They turned into an object, target number one, or an obstacle to state security. This linguistic and cognitive distortion allowed the agent to maintain sanity at first. However, beyond the training camps, reality proved to be much more viscous and complex. The first assignment always became the point of no return. In memoirs and declassified interrogation protocols of former employees, the same detail often surfaces: the moment when the performer's gaze meets the gaze of the one whose life is about to end. In this microscopic moment, all state ideology and headquarters orders crumble, leaving the person alone with the fact of an irreversible action. Looking at the external layer of this conflict, we see a clash of state interests with the fates of individuals. In the era of the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, the world was divided into spheres of influence, and each side considered it its right to eliminate threats by any means. Professional liquidators worked in conditions of utmost secrecy, using an arsenal that struck the imagination with its effectiveness. These were not only standard means, but also complex technical devices, silent pneumatic mechanisms disguised as umbrellas or pens, chemical compositions leaving no traces upon examination, and even the use of radioactive isotopes. Each operation was planned for months, taking into account transport schedules, the target's habits, and even the weather forecast. The visible conflict here consisted of a constant game of preemption. State machines spent millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours just to cross one name off the list of the living. The executor in this scheme was only the last link, the finger pressing the trigger, but it was he who bore the full weight of the physical embodiment of state will. The agent's internal conflict developed much slower, but acted more destructively. Imagine a person leading two parallel lives, never intersecting with each other. In one reality, he is Nikolai or John, who fixes the fence at the dacha on weekends, discusses gasoline prices with his neighbor, and takes his children to the zoo. He wears an old sweater, loves homemade pelmeni, and is genuinely upset when his football team loses. But as soon as a special phone rings or a short encrypted note arrives, this person disappears. His place is taken by a subject without a name, possessing a set of fake passports and legends. He can be a businessman in Munich, a tourist in Mexico City, or a journalist in Paris. The constant change of identities leads to the authentic I beginning to blur. Who is he really? The one who loves his wife, or the one who coldly observes a target through a telescopic sight? This dissociation, the separation of consciousness, is a classic symptom of severe psychological trauma that the agent voluntarily inflicts upon himself for higher purposes. Everyday details of such a life emphasize the tragedy of the situation. Many operatives recalled that the most difficult part of the job was returning home. After completing a mission, they needed time for decompression. They could sit for hours in an empty room, staring into space, or aimlessly drive around the city. The smell of gunpowder, the taste of adrenaline and cold calculation had to give way to the warmth of the hearth. But this transition became increasingly agonizing. The psyche cannot instantly switch from hunter mode to family man mode. Often this led to outbursts of unmotivated aggression or, conversely, to complete emotional numbness. The family saw before them a man who was physically present at the dinner table, but mentally thousands of kilometers away, in a dirty alley, or in an ambush on a rooftop. Living two lives, real and operational, created an irreparable rift in the soul that did not heal for decades. At the ideological and philosophical level, the conflict reached its climax in the question of the right to terminate life. State ideologists instilled in agents that they were sanitizers of history. Metaphors from medicine were used. The elimination of a dangerous element was compared to the removal of gangrene or a cancerous tumor. This allowed them to temporarily silence the voice of conscience, substituting universal human morality with the concept of state necessity. However, the philosophical paradox was that, while defending their nation's right to life and prosperity, the agent systematically violated this very right in relation to others. Over time, this led to total nihilism. If one person's life can be so easily ended by an order from an office, then what is the value of life in general? What is the value of the agent's own life? In the eyes of the liquidator, the world turned into dry statistics, into a set of numbers and coordinates. The value of human existence depreciated, turning into nothing. This led to the agent losing connection with humanity as such, feeling like a being of a different order, an instrument, standing outside good and evil, yet infinitely lonely in its emptiness. The transformation of the personality was so profound that it affected even physiological reactions. Declassified psychiatric profiles indicate that professional liquidators eventually experienced changes in their hormonal background and the functioning of their autonomic nervous system. They ceased to experience fear in situations that would horrify an ordinary person, yet suffered from severe panic attacks in absolutely peaceful settings. A key turning point in their perception often occurred after making a mistake or after seeing the underside of the system. For example, when it became clear that the eliminated target was merely a pawn in their superior's corrupt scheme and not an enemy of the people. At this moment, the ideological construct collapsed, leaving the person alone with what they had done. It was the realization that they were not a savior of the fatherland, but an accomplice in a crime disguised as state service. After such an epiphany, the path back to faith in the system and to peaceful sleep was completely closed. The culmination of a liquidator's life often came at the moment of their retirement or decommissioning. The system, which for years had demanded extreme dedication from them, instantly lost interest as soon as they ceased to be effective. Finding themselves in a social vacuum, without clear orders or operational tasks, the person encountered an unbearable silence. The entire accumulated burden of memories, previously suppressed by active work, surfaced. In psychiatry, this is described as delayed post-traumatic stress disorder, exacerbated by the specifics of their work. These individuals could not seek help from ordinary doctors as they were bound by non-disclosure agreements. They could not confide in friends because they had no friends who knew the truth. The isolation became absolute. Many sought salvation in religion, hoping for redemption. Others retreated to remote provinces, striving to distance themselves as much as possible from any manifestations of civilization. But it was impossible to escape from oneself. To understand the depth of falling into a psychological abyss, it is necessary to consider the fates of those who became the living embodiment of this tragedy. History has preserved the names of people who, as cogs in giant state machines, traveled the path from elite executors to broken individuals whose lives turned into an endless escape from their own past. These examples clearly demonstrate how different systems, from the Soviet bloc to Western democracies, ground human material, leaving behind only shadows of former greatness. One of the most striking and frightening examples is the fate of Bogdan Stashinsky, a Soviet intelligence agent of the late 1950s. His case is unique in that it demonstrates the mechanics of a complete personality transformation. A young man, initially not contemplating a career in the security services, was recruited and trained to carry out missions of special importance in Western Europe. He was taught not just to eliminate targets, but to do so as discreetly as possible, using a then innovative weapon, poison gas, which left no traces upon autopsy. Stashinsky successfully completed 2 missions in Munich, for which he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Battle. However, it was precisely at the moment of triumph that his internal disintegration began. The domestic side of Stashinsky's life turned into torture. He fell in love with a German woman, Inga Pohl, and this attachment became the irremediable rift that psychologists speak of. He had to lie to her about his work, conceal the true reasons for his absences, and constantly be under the supervision of his own handlers. The system demanded complete isolation from human feelings from him, but his love for the woman restored his capacity for empathy, which proved fatal for him. Ultimately, unable to bear the double life and the burden of his deeds, he committed an unprecedented act. He fled to the West with his wife the day before the construction of the Berlin Wall. But even there he found no peace. His testimony in court shocked the world. He described his actions not as feats, but as a mechanical execution of orders that deprived him of sleep and a sense of reality. His subsequent fate is hidden behind a veil of new names and plastic surgeries, which is a classic finale for an eliminator, the complete disappearance of identity. Let's move to another continent, where in the same years, a program known by the code name Phoenix was operating. During the conflict in Vietnam, American Special Services created a system for identifying and neutralizing key enemy figures. This was not just a war, but an industrial conveyor belt for eliminating people. The executors of the Phoenix program faced the fact that their work turned into a routine. One of the program participants later recalled that after the 100th sortie, he stopped perceiving what was happening as reality. The people he removed from the lists seemed to him like characters in a computer game that hadn't even been invented yet. However, upon returning to the United States, these specialists discovered that they could not integrate into peaceful society. The problem was not only post-traumatic stress disorder, but also that the state officially denied the scale and nature of their activities. They found themselves in a situation where their professional achievements were considered war crimes in the eyes of society, and at the same time, secret exploits in the eyes of the government. This duality led to widespread cases of social degradation. Former eliminators sought refuge in isolation on remote farms, where they could control the perimeter of their property like a combat zone. One veteran of the program admitted that even 20 years after completing his service, he cannot sit in a restaurant without scanning the faces of everyone present for potential threats. His psyche remained forever in the jungle, and the value of life, both his own and others, remained for him at the level of statistical error. No less indicative is an example from Israeli history, associated with Operation Wrath of God. After the tragic events at the Munich Olympics in 1972, a group of agents was formed whose task was to eliminate the organizers of the crime around the world. These people were considered heroes, avengers for their people. They possessed the highest level of motivation and ideological conviction. But even this armor of righteous anger did not save them from destruction. One of the group's operatives, known by the pseudonym Avner, later described how his perception of the world gradually changed. In the beginning, each eliminated adversary seemed an act of justice. But over time, the targets became increasingly blurred, and the methods increasingly brutal. Situations arose where innocent people could be harmed during operations. It was at these moments that the ideological conflict transitioned into a personal one. Agents began to ask themselves, how are they different from those they hunt? Constant life under assumed names, in cheap hotels, far from families, turned them into paranoids. They began to suspect their own leadership of betrayal and each other of weakness. When the operation was officially completed, many group members found they couldn't return to normal office work or raising children. Their inner world was scorched. Avner, for example, spent the rest of his life constantly changing residences and distrusting even his closest associates, asserting that the hunter never ceases to be prey in his imagination. These cases from different countries and ideologies converge at one point. The psychological profile of an executioner has universal traits of destruction. Regardless of what ideals the state hides behind, the protection of socialism, the fight for democracy, or national revenge, the result for the executor is always the same. An executioner is a person whose future has been taken away, forced to stare into the abyss of the past for too long. The state uses their best qualities to turn them into tools, and then discards them when the mechanism wears out. A study of classified psychiatric reports shows that most such agents develop profound anhedonia, an inability to experience pleasure, by the age of 40. They lose their taste for food, interest in art, and warmth in relationships. Their life turns into dry statistics of survival. This is the true price of transforming a human into an instrument of power. They didn't just carry out assignments, they surrendered their ability to be human in exchange for the illusion of control over history. And today, looking at these examples, we understand that the most terrible secret of special services is not the names of targets or the technical details of operations, but what ghosts those who agreed to become the invisible hand of the state turn into. The significance of this topic today extends far beyond the history of special services. We live in a world where violence is becoming increasingly technological and anonymous. A combat drone operator pressing a button in an air-conditioned office across the ocean from his target goes through the same stages of dehumanization as agents of the past. We see how easily the human psyche succumbs to manipulation when offered the right ideology. The lessons learned from the fates of state executioners scream one thing at us. You cannot turn a person into a tool without destroying the human within them. The true cost of such actions is always higher than any political or strategic benefits. Today, as conflicts flare up with renewed vigor, we must remember these invisible victims of the system, people whose souls were ground by the millstones of state expediency. The resonance of these stories reminds us of the fragility of moral barriers and how easy it is to lose oneself in a labyrinth of justifications and lies. The conclusion of this tragic chronicle brings us back to that very man in the hotel room. Now we understand that his suitcase is filled not merely with tools, but with fragments of his own life. Each executed order was a hammer blow to his own conscience. The final thought that should remain with us is that in this game, there are no winners. The state gains a temporary advantage, but loses its best citizen, transforming him into a ghost. The agent himself receives rewards and titles, but loses the ability to love, to trust, and simply to taste life. The cycle closes. Violence, born of fear and ideology, ultimately devours its creators and perpetrators. And until we learn to value each individual life above state abstractions, this conveyor belt for producing broken souls will continue its work in the shadows of history. This text is a deep exploration of the human psyche under the oppression of extreme circumstances. We have examined how external attributes of power and strength conceal internal emptiness and destruction. We have seen that returning to normality for those who have crossed the line is not just a difficult task, but a biological and psychological impossibility. The history of state liquidators is an eternal reminder that every choice we make has a price, and sometimes that price is our right to be called human.